to be a part of this very fascinating conversation we'll experience on the Israel-Gaza war 100 days later. Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for being a part, more importantly, of a community that's dedicated to learning and understanding these deep, complex issues of this war that we are all enduring. We have witnessed over the past 100 days such great pain and suffering and deaths. It is truly harrowing. And words can't describe the deep pain and grief that so many have experienced directly, and those of us here who experience indirectly as well. It is important to take time to acknowledge the enormity of all the lives that have been lost through war or violence. But there's hope. That hope comes tonight in the gathering of this community, because this is a space where we can engage in reflective thinking, where we can have moments of greater learning and understanding, where we can exhibit civil discourse and a culture of respect. Most importantly, a deep appreciation for the plurality of thought, not just on this war, but on all things, most especially the complex. This is what universities do. It's not what we can do. It's not what we must do. It's what we do. And if the public doesn't see the value of what this event is all about and what universities do, well, we have much bigger problems in our society and our community that threaten democracy. But the turnout here tonight gives me such great hope that, in fact, you do value what universities bring to our communities and to our societies. It's events like these in our classroom, through mentorship and conversations with peers and through study, that we dig deeply and disagree. We disagree with respect, all seeking to become better leaders and thinkers that can impact the world for the better. And this is especially true for our students here at the University of Denver, University of Colorado at Boulder, and all the other great universities in the state of Colorado, or our country for that matter. So thank you for being here tonight, but more importantly, thank you for being a part of something bigger. And that is a deeper understanding of the tragedy that this war has brought. Thank you to our incredible panelists that are here tonight. I know my wife and I are truly excited to hear what you have to say. And most especially, thank you to the Korbel School for International Studies for making all of this possible tonight. And without further ado, I invite our very, very famous dean here, Dean Fritzmayer. Thank you.
Famous in small circles anyway. Lovely to see such a turnout, and echoing Jeremy's comments, it is really heartening that we can have such an event this evening. Jeremy said I'm the dean here at the Korbel School, very proud to be hosting this. And so on behalf of our Center for Middle East Studies, also in partnership with the Denver Gazette and Channel 9 News, we're really delighted to welcome all of you to tonight's forum on the Israel-Hamas war 100 days later. The Center for Middle East Studies here is a really vibrant intellectual hub dedicated to the exploration and understanding of the rich and diverse cultures, histories, and societies of the Middle East and North Africa. The center is committed to academic freedom, as we are all here at the Korbel School and indeed at DU. The power of knowledge and informed dialogue to foster mutual understanding. The center's interdisciplinary approach brings together scholars and students from various fields to engage in rigorous research, thoughtful discussions, and collaborative projects. I don't need to tell you the conflict between Israel and Hamas has been the source of, as the Chancellor said, incredible impact and emotion and trauma and tragedy. And on campuses, great volatility around the country. And what we are seeking here at the Corbell School and at DU is to offer a model of critical engagement and civil discourse. So for that reason, there's just some basic ground rules for this event to ensure the success of what we're doing this evening. So let me just go through them quickly. We invite debate and challenges, and we expect some challenging questions, but no heckling, insulting, or otherwise disrupting the panelists. Anyone who does that will be asked to leave. As the subject of highly contentious is so highly contentious, that we really hope that people will set aside their preconceived views and listen attentively to the different perspectives of our experts. I know in my message to our community, I said our challenge here is to reject the simple story, because it is not a simple story, it is a complex story, and to think hard and rigorously about the events. There'll be an opportunity for questions. Please pose them civilly and respectfully. I don't see any flags or signs of any description, but we ask that not happen. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce the panel this evening, beginning with the director of our Center for Middle East Studies, Professor Micheline Ishai, who will be moderating the forum. Professor Ishai is Professor of International Studies and Human Rights here at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. She was founding director of our International Human Rights Program. She's the author of a half dozen books, including Internationalism and Its Betrayal, the Nationalism Reader, more recently, the Levant Express, the Arab Uprising, Human Rights, and the Future of the Middle East, the history of the Middle East from ancient times to the globalization era. And her works has been translated into multiple languages. She's been a visiting professor in universities around the world, located in places such as Jerusalem, Abu Dhabi, Bellagio, Berlin, Paris, and Washington, D.C. And she's lived on 3 of the world's regions, including the Middle East. So delighted, Micheline. And let me congratulate Micheline and her staff on organizing the event this evening. I will go through the rest of our panelists in alphabetical order. Ahmed Abradou is teaching assistant professor here at the University of Denver's Corbell School. Abradou has published articles on democratization in Egypt and other Arab nations. He's known for his specializations in civil military relations, political Islam, and democratization in the Middle East. His most recent books are Good Governance and Civil Security Relations, a comparative study of Turkey and Egypt, and the modern history of Egypt. Welcome, Ahmed. Gary Grappo is a former U.S. ambassador and is currently a distinguished fellow at our Center for Middle East Studies. As a career member of the Foreign Service, he served as envoy and head of mission of the Office of the Quartet Representative, the Honorable Mr. Tony Blair in Jerusalem. He was Minister Counsel for Political Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, U.S. Ambassador to Oman, and Charge d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission of the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. In Washington, he served as Director of the Office of Regional Affairs of the Near East Bureau of the Department of State. Welcome, Gary. Karim Matar is Associate Professor in the English Department at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Thanks for coming down with us. He writes and teaches in the areas of world literature, the history of the novel, the Middle East, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and critical theory. He's the author of Specters of World Literature, Orientalism, Modernity, and the Novel in the Middle East, and with Anna Ball, co-editor of the Edinburgh Companion to the Postcolonial Middle East. Jonathan Sharkin is Associate Professor of History and Judaic Studies and Chair of the Department of History here at DU. He teaches undergraduate courses on Islamic and Middle Eastern history, Israeli and Palestinian history, the history of U.S.-Israeli relations, and how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been discussed in the United States. He's published a book entitled Educational Oases in the Desert, the Alliance Israelite Universel's Girls' School in Ottoman Iraq, 1895 to 1950. Thank you all panelists for being with us this evening. And with that, I will turn to Professor Ishai to both frame and start the conversation with our panelists. Micheline.
Thank you, all of you, to be here. Thank you, Denver. Good evening. Good evening to all of us, all of you who are watching us on webinar. It's great to see such a nice attendance focusing on a very important topic. I would like to thank the chancellors, of course, and the partnership with the Denver Gazette and Channel 9 News. Thank you so much for being here. And particularly also, I would like to thank the Center for Middle East Study, the whole team, Connor Farwell, Jonathan Staple, the program manager, and the many students who have volunteered to help with this event. The tech people at the end, thank you as well. Kristen Gjelstein, Stephanie Worden, Bini Montoya, and all the other staff who are working behind the scene. You're not forgotten, and I won't acknowledge you at the end now. We'll do it right up front. I was asked to introduce a little bit the events of October 7, and then I decided just to go very briefly. I know that the panelists are going to add to the very benchmark and historical fact that I'm providing here. But let me try to rewind the tape. Oh, yeah, that's the tape. Rewind the tape a little bit. And rather than speaking about October 7, I just want to briefly talk about October 6. If you were just in October 6th, what do you think the Middle East looked like? I mean, this is sort of a question I was asking myself. We always talk about the day after, but the day before is actually also an interesting question. So on October 6th, Lebanon was experiencing a deep economic crisis, and Hezbollah leader Nasrallah threatened to deport Lebanon's 800 Syrian refugees to Europe. In Syria, we had 90 more people who died, adding to the total over 630,000 people killed and 30 million displaced in the 13 years of the country's civil war. There, the dictatorship Bashar al-Assad had enlisted Iran, Hezbollah, along with massive bombing by Russia, all but crushing an uprising by the Sunni Muslim majority. In Yemen, there was a civil war that had recently paused, and the Yemeni Sunni Muslims, backed by the Saudis and the UAE, had lost to Shia Houthi tribesmen supported by Iran, leading to a ceasefire in a still very divided country. 377,000 people had died, and in one of the worst humanitarian disasters that the world was in the world, and it's still continuing in certain ways. Saudi Arabia on October 6 was still negotiating a peace agreement with Israel as a part of a new round of the Abraham Accord, long-standing peace treaty with Egypt and Jordan, which were the impending Israeli-Saudi agreement, would have ended the state of war potentially between Israel and the major Arab states. Okay. In Iran, the million protest movement, Women, Life, Freedom, has just marked its first year weakening the Islamic theocratic government. On October 6, it was also the Jewish holiday of Sukkot. 4,400 young people were celebrating love and peace at the Nova Music Festival close to the border with Gaza. Throughout the countries, hundreds of thousands of Israelis were preparing once again for the protest scheduled for the next day against the ultra-right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu. It was the beginning of the 10th month of weekly mass protest against Netanyahu's attempt to cripple Israel's judicial branch and threaten Israel's democracy. In the West Bank, a Jewish settlers killed a 19-year-old Palestinian university student in a continuation of violence between settlers and Palestinians that had intensified under the recently formed right-wing government of Netanyahu. Judicial segregations between Palestinians and close to 700 500 or 700, depending how we count it, settlers continue in part of the West Bank, but still we see that 130,000 Palestinians from the West Bank were crossing the border to work in Israel. In Gaza, just missed that one. Okay, in Gaza, there had been a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas since 2021, and with Islamic Jihad since May 2023. In this seemingly relative peace, 80,000 workers were working in Israel in an effort to overcome the burdens of the blockade. In July 2023, 67% of Gazans voiced great distrust for Hamas in a poll. So let me just go, yeah. So what seemed to be at first comparatively all quiet on the Western Front turned overnight in a very dramatic way. There was a brutal and unprecedented massacre felt upon Israel when Hamas attacked by land, air, sea to kill 1,200 people in one day. The most horrid attack against Jews since the Holocaust. Claiming the right to self-defense, the IDF retaliation was predictable and very severe. On October 8th, Israel began airstrikes against targets in Gaza while calling up for 300,000 reservists and preparing for ground invasion. The IDF stated purpose was to destroy a Hamas operative and infrastructure in order to defeat its military wing. Today, just over 100 days since the war began, nearly 2 million Palestinians from Gaza have been displaced, thousands of homes have been destroyed, and over 24,000 killed. The number of Hamas combatants is so far unclear. 7,000 Gazans remain missing, and an additional 36,000 have been injured. On the Israeli side, we know that 1,200 Israelis have been killed, including 185 soldiers. 250,000 Israelis have been displaced, 12,000 injured, and 166 still held hostage at Gaza. Now, of course, all those numbers are subject to final verification. But the sheer scale of death and destruction in Gaza has caused many international observers to say that Israel is conducting the war too forcefully and too indiscriminately. This position was evoked at the International Court of Justice last week when South Africa raised a more specific accusation of genocide, to which Israel has responded by dismissing the charge, arguing that Hamas was the one that committed genocide, that its conduct was consistent with international law of war, and that it could not coexist with the terrorist organization as it did done in the past. Today, the Israeli operation is still ongoing. The IDF argued that it did not reach the goal of dismantling Hamas or rescuing the hostages. It has reduced its ground force while turning its focus to Hamas military infrastructure in the south, evidently settling for a long campaign. What is the next stage? I won't speak to it in the minutes that was allocated here. It's complicated and unknown. It begs the question of interim and final security and political architectures and the hand of hostility. But I will leave this and other questions to the panelists, and I will also invite them to add more on the events that I just recounted. So thank you for that initial. Oh, before I finish, I have to plug something here. There will be a couple upcoming events. One of them, which I have the pleasure to share with Ahmed Abdurabu, which will be held with the World Denver on February 1st. But we will have at the university 2 events by international legal scholar, one on sexual violence during the war. The title will be finalized with Ruth Halperin Kadari, and then one with Professor David Kretzmer, who is an international renowned legal scholar of human rights and is part of the Department of Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, but also was the founder of B'Tselem Human Rights Organization. He will be coming here February 28th. And those two events are co-sponsored with the Center for Judaic Study. So with this, I'm going to just turn to my panelists and ask them questions that they're waiting so long. Can you hear me? Right, how are you all? Can you all hear me? Perfect. Okay, this is a very interesting panel. I'm very excited to be with all of you. I just want to tell to the audience that I've already discussed the topic with the panelists in advance, but I've not told them the exact question for good reason. They argue. Because you wouldn't believe. We already had 3 events before this one. I will start for one person each time and we'll allow others to jump if they wish. So that's what we're going to do. Please keep your response brief, no more than 3 minutes. This is Middle East negotiation, as we have a lot of ground to cover. Yeah, so please understand that. So the first topic will be about academic freedom, something that is probably dear here to the people on the first row. There have been many questions about the limits of free speech on university campuses in the wake of protests and demonstration about this conflict. What can we learn from this moment with regard to free speech and critical conversations, especially in an academic environment? Should I start with you, Jonathan?
Sure. I'm happy to take this. I do have strong opinions on this topic. I think academic freedom of speech is essential on campuses. I think that universities as an institution, I stress as an institution, should remain neutral on political topics so that they can allow their faculty and students to have a robust debate without feeling like they're not allowed to share their views. One thing I have to note, and this is as a historian, this is someone who teaches undergraduates, this is someone who has followed these issues for a long period of time, and they directly impact my teaching, my career, and my students. The issue of freedom of speech with regard to discussing Israel-Palestine, with regard to discussing the Arab-Israeli conflict, with regard to discussing Jewish history or Muslim history, did not start on October 7th. It has a long history. And I'm not going to go back and talk about the long history. I haven't written a book on it or anything, but I will go back a few years. We have had a series of laws being passed in state legislatures over the last decade, seeking to penalize people who support the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, BDS movement, working in state governments, which I view as an attack on free speech. I will note, I don't mind saying this, I have not been a supporter of BDS. I am not someone who's ever signed a BDS petition. But I believe that people have the right to support BDS and not have to fear career reprisal or academic reprisal for their positions. Just like I would support people taking a strong stand in support of Israel without having to face any kind of penalty for taking that kind of stand. We also, especially for those of us who deal with subjects that in any way touch on anti-Semitism, we have the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, which, by the way, I have no problem with the definition. I won't read it here. But some of their definitions of what could constitute anti-Semitism, in my view, are problematic. One of them says, treating Israel with double standards, but it's really vague. It doesn't say what that means, or in a sense, denying the Jewish right to a state. I am not someone who denies the legitimacy of the state of Israel or Israel's right to exist, but I'm a historian who has to teach courses where I use primary sources that talk about anti-Zionist positions. Could that be considered anti-Semitic? I'm not sure. Could my students face penalties under Title VI for talking about these issues? I'm not sure. The Obama administration adopted this definition by the State Department in the late 2000s. The Trump administration adopted this for the Department of Education by executive order in 2021. These are issues that really scare me and I think are really meant to curtail freedom of speech, both in the public sphere, but also in academic institutions. And I believe that universities should, I don't know what the rules are. I'm not a lawyer. I would like to think that if someone were brought up on Title VI because they were reading a document on anti-Zionism from 1910, that they would not be considered anti-Semitic. And I'm sure they would be, exonerated from that charge. But the fact that they could even be potentially brought up on that charge, I find problematic. We've seen this elsewhere as well. There was an example. Oh, sorry. Can I just have 10 seconds? I have tunnel vision. I'm an only child. I have ADHD, so I apologize. We do have an example at the University of Minnesota where an adjunct faculty member lost their position for showing a visual depiction of the Prophet Muhammad. I understand that is disrespectful or some students take that as a sign of disrespect, but I do believe in an academic setting, faculty should have the right to run their classes and to show students images or to talk about topics that some students find uncomfortable. So again, I know I didn't quite answer the question post October 7th. What I wanted to highlight is this is not something that started on October 7th.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to go to this side and then back to here.
Yeah, one thing that I'm really concerned about is watching the hearings where the president of Harvard was just in this room answering some questions. And one very particular question just stood out to me, and I'm here quoting. The question that was directed from the head of the education committee at the Congress to the president of Harvard was, are you aware that the term intifada refer to the genocide of all the Jews? And then the president of Harvard was trying to answer, and then the leader or the head of the committee was just insisting that she should answer yes or no, and she kept insisting that there should be a yes or no answer. And my concern here, not just about bringing the president of a university or provost or someone official in higher education to the Congress, congressional hearings, but it's much more of this linguistic wars. As an Arabic native speaker, I can confirm that the word intifada has nothing to do at all with killing all Jew or genocide. I mean, it's totally unrelated. It means literally uprising, which can be used in different contexts. And unfortunately, I'm not sure if the president of Harvard was trying to correct her or not, but she was not given any real chance to even, tell her what positions or what might the term mean. So again, back to the question of anti-Semitism, and I guess I said that before, we have to recognize, at least this is my position, I have to say it out clear, that yes, anti-Semitism exists. As someone who grew up in Egypt in the 1980s, that was a time when Egypt and Israel had peace, but I grew up with many, movies and soap dramas where, the Jew, not just the Israelis or the Zionists, the Jew were kind of like depicted as mean people or selfish people, or so anti-Semitism exists. However, my main concern with recent developments is this term sometimes is either exaggerated or politicized to silence some scholars who may want to be critical to, let's say, Benjamin Netanyahu. If I'm criticizing Benjamin Netanyahu, in my point of view, that doesn't make me anti-Semitic at all. In my writings, I'm very critical to the Egyptian government, and that doesn't make me anti-Egyptian. I'm very critical to some American presidents. I'm not going to mention names, but that doesn't make me anti-American. So again, my concern is how sometimes these terms, while we should all agree, or I guess we should agree that they exist, sometimes are either exaggerated or politicized.
Perfect timing, Ahmed. Karim.
Thank you so much, Micheline, and thank you, Jonathan, Ahmed, for the wonderful comments. Just picking up on something that Jonathan said. Oh, is this better? Okay, thank you. Picking up on something Jonathan said, that the repression of campus speech advocating for Palestinian human rights did not start on October 7th. It's been a decades-long process. I mentioned a book in our conversations with the panel entitled Out of Bounds, Academic Freedom and the Question of Palestine, published by Matthew Abraham in 2014. 2014 is a significant year in these kinds of conversations. That was the year in which Stephen Salaita, who was hired by the Indigenous Studies Department at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, was dehired from his position for a Twitter feed, which had nothing to do with his official university duties. This is just one particularly public incident that demonstrates the decades of repression that Palestinian and scholars and students who speak on behalf of Palestinian human rights have faced in this country, in academic institutions in this country. There's a serious systematic problem that has to be addressed. And one thing that's happened, given the intensification and acceleration of these kinds of attacks on pro-Palestinian students and scholars in the wake of October the 7th, is that it's brought this deeper history to light. It's something that I believe we in academic institutions have to collectively grapple with as we grapple with the increasing incidence of anti-Semitism on university campuses at this time. As Ahmed mentioned, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic incidents on campuses have themselves also accelerated and intensified. However, the statistics provided by the Anti-Defamation League, which most newspapers and universities rely on when judging these, have to be disaggregated from incidents of speech which is critical of Israel. One of the functions of the IHRA definition, the Jonathan of anti-Semitism, that Jonathan referred to, is to conflate criticisms of the practices and policies of the State of Israel towards the Palestinian people with anti-Semitism. And I would say that that undermines the actual existence of anti-Jewish hatred in the United States today. It undermines the actual occurrence of anti-Semitic incidents. And this is something that we in our neutral academic institutions have to collectively address in order to get to the heart of this problem. Finally, in my remaining 38 seconds, I'd like to point out that while anti-Semitic discourse and representation does exist in the Middle East, in Palestine, and elsewhere, this is a relatively recent phenomenon in the Middle East, which started coming to light in the wake of 1948. There is no deep-rooted systemic hatred of Jewish people or even a history of intercommunal violence between Jews, Arabs, and Christians in the Middle East. Throughout the 1400 years of Arab Islamic history, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities lived for the large part in conditions of security, trust, and mutual recognition throughout the dominions of Islam. Anti-Semitism is a European phenomenon unto 1948, unto the Holocaust, and this is something that has to be recognized in our discussions of this very important topic in our academic institutions.
Well, thank you. But there were 75 years since. Okay, can you just get to Gary Grappo? I'm almost tempted to add something to the question. I just wonder, why do you think that there have been higher number of casualties in recent war, Yemen, Syria, and yet this event, this conflict, galvanized world attention more than anything else? What are your thoughts? Why is that happening?
Well, this particular issue, of course, resonates deeply, certainly in the Middle East, but in our country as well. Sadly, too few Americans, unless American troops are involved, pay attention to these crises, which, sad to say, having spent 20 years of my professional life in the region, are not an unusual occurrence. You mentioned Yemen. There's Syria, there's Libya, there's the ongoing crisis, which is produced, by the way, far more refugees in Sudan. There is the ongoing oppression of the people in Iran by that regime, and we could go on. But this issue resonates very, very profoundly here in this country, and therefore gets a lot of attention in the American public, and most certainly in the American media and in the American government. As I had mentioned in the session that we had in October, United States, and there's no mystery to this, has a very special relationship with the state of Israel. And we have had that since 1948, when the United States was the first country to recognize Israel's independence. That has not changed. What has changed is that the commitment has become deeper because, for example, we did not provide the materiel support when it comes to defensive weapons or offensive until the 1960s, when finally John Kennedy agreed to provide weapons. So that relationship has only deepened over the course of the years. And then, of course, with the 67 and 73 war, it's become more profound. So there is a strong tie to Israel on the part of not only the United States government, but the American people who genuinely like Israel and support Israel. On the other hand, there is also support for Palestinians in this country. And in fact, many Americans, I'd say most Americans, actually support the Palestinian state. The current administration supports the Palestinian state and has made that public repeatedly, even before October 7th. So the attention that this has garnered to me is not a surprise, because throughout my public life, it's always been the first question that I'm asked as an American diplomat. And then occasionally, if American troops are involved, oh, let's move on to Iraq or some other area in which we were involved. This is not going to change. I think the commitment and the relationship that the United States has with Israel is enduring, but I must say, it is being tested today very, very sorely, and no one feels that more acutely than President Biden.
Okay, thank you very much. I love this clock in front of me. It's just doing my job. I just, as a mother, it is fantastic. I don't have to interrupt anyone. Okay, the most important causes of this most recent conflict. That's one of the topics that we're going to be discussing briefly. I described what was happening on the news on October 6th and how the outward peace was shattered the next day. But obviously, this conflict did not start the day before. So Channel 9 News asked an interesting question that I'm going to just here rephrase. How far back in time must one go in order to understand what is now happening now in Gaza? What do you think? I'm going to start with Ahmed on this and then move this way.
Okay. As a scholar, I would say 1948. And there is no way you can skip this date to understand. And again, whether you stand with the right of Israel to exist or not, this is not the matter. The matter is, as a matter of fact, since 1948, we started to have this Arab-Israeli conflict, which, and back to your question, which might be, as of now, understood as much more of as Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And why is that? And here is my explanation to October 7, is by October 6, many Palestinians, whether in the West Bank or in Gaza, thought that if Saudi Arabia is to join this Abrahamic Accords and normalize the relations with Israel, to join Egypt, Bahrain, I guess Morocco, Sudan, and United Arab Emirates and Jordan, then there's nothing left for them. And if that's to happen, then the Palestinian issue will be forever forgotten, and nobody will be able to offer them, another possible nation state. And in my point of view, this is why, unlike Syria and Yemen, and which, by the way, I have a very critical position even from the Arab responses to, the Palestinian issues, to the Yemeni and Syrians, because like all the Syrian massacres and Yemen massacres, they went, I don't want to say silent, but many Arabs didn't really respond that harsh as they do right now. But maybe because this time it's not Arab-Arab relations, it's not Arab-Arab conflicts, it's much more of an Arab-Israeli conflicts, Islamic, Jewish conflicts, etc. So we should go back to 1948. We should understand how, while Israel had the right to get an independent nation state, the Palestinians didn't get the very same right, even though international law stand by them. And I remember on October 6th, going back to your wonderful idea of just visiting October 6th and instead of just speaking about what happened after October 7, my wife lives in Michigan and I was with her in Michigan, and we decided to, that was October 6th by accident, we decided to watch a movie called Golda. And in this movie, for you who watched this movie, it's a movie about Prime Minister Golda Meir, the first and so far last female prime minister of Israel. And it was mainly not about her life, but it was mainly concentrating on the Six-Day War, 1973. And it was very interesting to see how Golda Meir, when Henry Kissinger visited her, trying to convince her for a ceasefire with the Egyptians, she insisted that the only condition she had to negotiate with the Egyptians is that the Egyptian side should call her by the name of the Prime Minister of Israel, not the Prime Minister of the Zionist entity. That was interesting because I was thinking on October 7, just before the attacks, I was thinking of how Israel was looking for this recognition back in 1973. And as of now, back in October 6, 2023, they got that much recognition. However, that was not given equally to the Palestinian side. So I guess this is part of the answer. My time's over.
Okay, thank you so much. I will move now to Jonathan on my right, and just do you agree with your colleague on the right, Ahmed? Is it 1948?
Yeah, so I want to respond because I really appreciated his comments. I also, by the way, just I see the screen this time, so if I start running out of time, I'll talk like the Micro Machines guy from those 80s commercials. Yeah, I think 48 is the right date, but to start with, but what I would like to do, again, this is the historian in me, just for people in the audience, and I could be wrong, this is how I conceptualize the evolution of this conflict, which is prior to 1948, we really saw a Zionist Arab conflict. I use Zionist not because I work for the Iranian government and won't use the word Israel. It didn't exist prior to 1948. I would say from 1948 through the late 70s, we see a conventional conflict between Israel and recognized Arab states. And since the 1979 Camp David peace accords between Israel and Egypt, we've really moved to an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in my view, along with, to a lesser extent, well, I shouldn't say lesser extent, but at the same time, a sort of Israeli-Iranian Cold War. And I say this because this I think goes to Ahmed's point, in my view, which is what happened over the course of the wake of the Second Intifada and the breakdown of Oslo. In my reading, Gary, I'd really be interested in your comments on this, but there's no pressure to chime in, is that the United States under the Obama administration and the George W. Bush administration in the second half were really trying to build up Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank to sort of show, if you play ball, you get support from the US, you get some carrots from Israel, and if you don't play ball, you get blockaded like Hamas in Gaza after the takeover in 2007. I think, Congress, especially after 2010, prevented the Obama administration from following through with that kind of policy. And I think Fatah and Abbas really, they had been losing credibility among Palestinians, but I think they really failed after that to keep the Palestinian issue consistently at the forefront of the international world. There are reasons for that. There's the outcome, the fallout of the global financial crisis, European financial crisis. There's sort of the rise of the tech industry in Israel and Gulf states wanting to better integrate into the global economy and looking to Israel for sort of, like a source of technological know-how and wanting reciprocal investment there. And then the Trump administration obviously was able to negotiate the Abraham Accords, which totally marginalized the Palestinians. I'm running out of time, but this leads me back to what Ahmed was talking about, which is, I think, from Hamas's perspective, and I don't support this, but I'm saying from their perspective, with Israel maybe likely to, in the near future, establish relations with Saudi Arabia and maybe some other states in the Middle East, they felt like this was the last time they could potentially prevent such an outcome and lead to their marginalization in the way that Fatah and Abbas were marginalized in the previous decade, at zero.
Okay, that is a long list of events since 1948, and 3 minutes. This is not easy to do. I will just see if we can highlight perhaps,
Yes.
Karim, a little bit.
I want that extra 5 seconds before my
got
timer officially
5, you got
starts. So 1948 is a particularly significant year for me and my family. That's the year every member of my father's family was forced into exile from their home in Jaffa, Palestine, including my 2-month-old father. Of course, that's ground zero of the Israel-Palestine conflict in total. 1896, the publication of Theodor Herzl's The Jewish State has to be taken into account, and the long history of European anti-Semitism that produced the idea of a Jewish state in historical Palestine has to be understood thoroughly in order to get to grips with the current crisis. Going back further, one might refer to Nur Masalhad, the famous and brilliant Palestinian historian's book, Palestine, a 4,000-year history, to understand the deep roots of this particular crisis. But regarding Gaza and October the 7th in particular, Hamas, while I agree with the analyses of Ahmed and Jonathan regarding normalization with Saudi Arabia and seeking to scupper that, their stated objectives and the stated reasons of the atrocities that they committed and possible war crimes that they committed on that fateful day was a year's worth of increasing settler and IDF violations in the West Bank, a year's worth of accelerating and intensifying violations at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem, and of course the 16 years of blockade that Gaza's civilian population has faced by the State of Israel along with Egypt. This is what Hamas itself stated that they were responding to in their attacks and atrocities. Regarding Gaza, I find alongside the work of Jean-Pierre Filiu, the work of the Harvard political scientist Sarah Roy, particularly poignant and powerful when understanding Gaza's deterioration. She cites 1967, the year Israel occupied Gaza in the wake of the Six-Day War, as ground zero of the current Gazan predicament, and she analyzes what the State of Israel and its policies and practices in Gaza has done in terms of de-development. The systematic dismantling of Gaza's civilian economy and infrastructure in order to establish a dependency on Israel, which leads to the kinds of work permits that Micheline was referring to in her introductory comments, the necessity for them, and a process which has accelerated since 1967 in the wake of the Intifada of the late 1980s, and especially since the establishment of the blockade in 2007. The conditions of life since 2007 in Gaza have been among the most obscene, morally obscene anywhere in the world. Former UK Prime Minister David Cameron called Gaza the world's largest open-air prison. And in addition to a blockade which has foreclosed food, medical equipment, economic supplies, and so on and so forth from entering the Gaza Strip, this period from 2007 to 2023 has seen a series of brutal and devastating wars on Gaza, 2008-9, 2012, 2014, 2018, and 2021, that might be considered retrospectively as dress rehearsals for the current war. So we have to understand all of these overlapping histories in order to understand October the 7th and its aftermath, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you so much, Karim. And also you got your 5 extra seconds. And I'm taking them away from you, Gary. No, but just for the sake of can you disagree with Karim?
You could pick almost any date in history, quite honestly, going back to Abraham's migration from the Ur Valley in Iraq to the place we now call Palestine, and thought he liked it and settled there. And that was, I don't know, so a couple of thousand, not quite 2,000 years before the current era. So as an American, we sometimes have a short frame of history. If you look at when the United States government took notice of this issue and how we as a government might address it, I go to 1944. Now, of course, that's World War II. United States is deeply, deeply involved on two fronts, in Europe and the Pacific. But shortly after the Yalta Conference, without the knowledge of almost anyone, Franklin Roosevelt made a detour and met with the King of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud, the founder of the modern state of Saudi Arabia, in the Red Sea on board a U.S. naval ship to talk about the period after the war, because both Ibn Saud and FDR were well aware that the Allies were going to emerge victorious and that the Middle East was going to be an area certainly of concern for the United States. Ibn Saud was looking for an ally, now knowing that he sat on the world's largest reserves of oil and no way to protect them. But the dominant subject of their conversation, the thing that they talked about in two long meetings that they had, were the European Jews and where they were going to go. And the president tried to persuade Ibn Saud about their moving to the Middle East, Palestine. Ibn Saud objected. He went back for a second go at it and failed again, and they reached an understanding in which the president promised that the United States would not make any moves in terms of major migration of the European Jews to Palestine without advising Ibn Saud. 1 month later or so, the president died. 1948 comes along. We have a new president, Harry Truman, who knew history as well as or better than almost any other American president, took note of the previous president's promise to Ibn Saud, and nevertheless decided that we would recognize the state of Israel. And then the problem snowballed from the United States' point of view from that in terms of our increased engagement over the years and an inability to extricate ourselves from it. The single reason being is that you cannot kill Palestinian nationalism. And it's been tried. And Bibi Netanyahu can continue to play the role of George III, and he will end up like George III. Palestinian nationalism is going to continue. It may manifest itself peacefully, as we saw in negotiations that did take place. Unfortunately, it failed from the late 1980s through the 90s and 2000, even up through 2005, and now through acts of violence. And the violence will continue until the Palestinians are given the other option of negotiating.
Let me deepen, thank you very much. Let me deepen a little bit into this question. I'm going to highlight first the goal and actions of Hamas, and then I do the same of the Israeli issue. So a number of observers have suggested that Hamas was more successful, if it can call it that, than one expected, that even they expected on October 7th. So from a strategic perspective, first, what do you think Hamas hoped to gain on that day? And how do you think their objectives might have changed in the last 100 days? We start with you.
Well, I'm happy to kick things off. I gave a partial answer to this particular question in my previous response. I interpret Hamas's actions as a manifestation of the suffering of Gaza's population, especially over the last 16 years, but over a longer history. I interpret it in emotional, spiritual, existential terms. The numbers have been revised today as of the State of Israel. According to the Israeli Ministry of Defense, 1,147 Israelis were murdered on October the 7th, revising 1,200 estimate, and previously their 1,400 estimate, including approximately 300 soldiers. The rest of them are civilians, including the young people at the Nova Music Festival. Like Ahmed and Jonathan said, part of the overall strategic imperative was to scupper the Abraham Accords. But again, the Saudis were unambiguous in the year of negotiations with the Americans and the Israelis about the condition of normalization with Israel being a path towards a Palestinian state. The foreign minister, Faisal bin Farhan, had been stating that repeatedly. MBS himself, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and de facto leader of Israel, had been saying it. Sorry, excuse me. Of Saudi Arabia had been saying that repeatedly in the run-up to this period. And recently, we've heard reports from American news organizations that normalization is still on the table for the Saudis at the end of this war, if there is an end to this war, and on the condition of a path towards Palestinian statehood. It is unambiguous. If Israel is to be integrated into a peaceful and prosperous Middle East, there has to be a solution to the Palestinian problem. I want to stress, and I'd be fascinated to hear Ambassador Grappo's perspectives on this, that this is an American security, economic, political, and diplomatic interest as well. A safe and secure Israel within a peaceful and prosperous Middle East is good for American business. It is good for American politics, geopolitics, vis-a-vis much graver threats posed to American power in the 21st century, coming from China and coming from Russia. Hamas, I know the question was about Hamas. I've spiraled a little bit away from that, but you know, I'm glad to have had the opportunity to express some other thoughts about the consequences and effects of Hamas's actions on that particular day.
Okay, so thank you, Karim. Let's have the diplomat to spiral a little bit on that question as well. Can I just address your view, because since this is what Karim suggested, what do you want to chime in, Gary, and tell us what do you think were the goal and actions of Hamas since October 7? Did they change? Was it successful? Would it make a difference?
I would certainly agree with Karim that Hamas probably recognized that the Palestinian issue writ large, and certainly Hamas were being sidelined by what was taking place in the Middle East with the Abraham Accords and with the increased communication, dialogue, and interaction between Israel and its Arab partners. Where I would disagree is I don't believe Hamas had any interest in manifesting the frustrations of Palestinians. I think Hamas was interested in advancing the interests of Hamas. If they truly cared about the Palestinian in Gaza, then they would have redirected all the monies that they spent on arming themselves and building this very intricate and extensive tunnel network on the people of Gaza, who don't have sufficient water, certainly now, but even before October 7th, didn't have sufficient food, and were severely constrained in their ability to interact politically in Gaza. I do not believe Hamas is all that interested in the people of Gaza. It's interested in the cause of Hamas. On the other hand, we certainly cannot ignore that the people of Gaza, as well as the people of the West Bank, are at a point of despair. And that despair manifested itself on October 7th in the cases of those Gazan civilians, not necessarily members of Hamas, who took part in this awful and horrific violence in southern Israel. It's a manifestation on their part of individual Gazans, but of West Bank residents as well, of the despair that they feel today. Khalil Shakaki, a very respected Palestinian scholar who teaches at the university in the West Bank, had written an article in 1998, extremely prescient, and I was able to find it recently. And the title of the article was "Peace Now, Hamas Later," or Hamas Later. And that's exactly what we got. He had written that if the Palestinian Authority, which had recognized the state of Israel and had initially negotiated with the state of Israel, fails in its effort to negotiate a two-state solution with the state of Israel, or if they lost the faith of the Palestinian people, that we should not be surprised if the Palestinian people throw their full weight of support toward Hamas. Unfortunately, that's where we are today, because for various reasons, the parties did not choose peace before, and we now have Hamas.
Okay, I know that Karim wants to answer, but I'm going to give first the microphone to Ahmed. I don't know if you want to chime in, otherwise.
Yeah, sure. I just may disagree a little bit with Karim. I mean, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, I agree with you that Saudi Arabia was very unambiguous when it comes to the conditions to normalize the relations with Israel. But, you know, not just Hamas, but I guess Palestinians have heard that many times before. You know, the Egyptians said when they normalized the relations with Israel, and President Sadat said it already, that, you know, the president of Egypt back in the 1970s, he said that, you know, this peace is to bring sovereignty and an independent state for the Palestinians, and it never happened. And the Emiratis said the same. And I guess even Morocco said the same. I mean, I don't really count that much on this commitment of Saudi Arabia, especially under Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, because it's not convincing to not just Hamas, but to the Palestinians. But back to the question, because it's very important. Hamas has always managed to consolidate their positions from the very beginning, 1987. As you know, Hamas was born with, I mean, at least a political organization, and the military wing was born in 1987 with the first Palestinian Intifada, first Palestinian uprising. Let's use uprising not to be accused of any anti-Semitism. And in the very first Palestinian uprising, 1987, they managed to take a very sharp position, which is as simple as we do not recognize the state of Israel. It's a zero-sum game. It's either we or them. It's we will liberate Palestine from the river, which is the Jordanian River, to the sea, which is the Mediterranean Sea. And they have been always able to consolidate their ideology, which it was and is still a very Islamic, pure Islamic ideology. And if you look to 1987 Covenant, which was a first ever political document issued by Hamas, you can read in English or in Arabic. It's a very clear Islamic, you know, very pre-modern kind of statement, political statements. We are an Islamic group. We will call upon Islamic nations to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. However, in 2017, there was a very important turning point, which I think is usually underestimated by scholars of the Middle East when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is a second covenant issued by Hamas in 2017 after so much pressures exerted by the Egyptians to rewrite the covenant of 1987. This time they issued a new one in 2017. And I know that maybe you agree or disagree with me that it's very true that they didn't recognize the state of Israel, but also they recognized what is called 1967 borders, which is technically recognizing the state of Israel. And also they denied relations with the Muslim Brotherhood, the historical enemy of the Egyptian government. And now they have been under fire from their own supporters because starting from 2017, they lost this, you know, consolidation. They are no longer the very, you know, known Islamic resistant groups. And in my point of view, October 7, partially at least, was another way to consolidate their power, to show to the world, not just to Israel or to Egypt or to others, how powerful they are and how self-sufficient they are when it comes to weaponry. And that was, you know, the attack of October 7 at a scale that was unprecedented and unexpected.
Yeah, thank you very much. You want to chime in? Or?
Just very briefly, I don't really have much to add. I was really happy with the points. I mean, I wanted to make a couple of them that you brought up, Ahmed. And here I want to just express I have to have some intellectual humility. I don't know, right? Like I don't know what the exact answer is. But one point I do want to bring up, and this is not necessarily about Hamas, it's about how people, again, should or do view them. And I don't know, again, what the answer is here. I think that over the last decade, many actors in the region, and I think even to some extent the Israeli government, believed that Hamas had sort of changed a little. It was interested in governing. Maybe it was interested in some sort of long-term peace, that maybe you could do business with it. You could use it as maybe even like a stalling tactic. And I think that one thing that I just think has to be out there and has to be said here is that the way that the attack unfolded, which was not a strategic military attack. I mean, it was a blatant terror attack that involved the killing of children. It involved significant amounts of sexual violence. I think that has convinced many people that what happened in 2007 was just PR, and that Hamas is the 1988, 1987, 1988 Hamas, and they've been trying to fool people for years. And so again, I don't have an answer to this, but I do think that this is a question that is out there that policymakers are going to have to answer. I'm a historian. I can't answer it. But it's an interesting question that I think needs to be raised.
You want to make you
Sure.
requested a
I think
the word?
Hamas has to be contextualized in the context of the failure of secular modernization processes through the entirety of the Middle East in the post-war period. Micheline was pointing towards the conditions of various Arab and Muslim countries on October the 6th, but it has to be understood as part of a wider Islamic revivalist movement in the entirety of the region in the wake of the failure of secular multicultural democracies due to imperial, colonial, and internal demagoguery in this region. Reading it alongside the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1978-79, alongside the resurgence of the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt, with which it's deeply affiliated. Ahmed Yassin studied in Egypt and took many of his ideas from the Muslim Brotherhood and sought to create a Palestinian variation of it in the establishment of Hamas in the 1980s, of the revival of Islamic governance in Turkey from the 1990s under Erdogan's various leaderships. All of these contexts have to be understood in relation to a wider dynamic, a historical dynamic, a modernization dynamic in the region, which has been heavily skewed by European involvement throughout the region. Orhan Pamuk, I'm a literary scholar. Orhan Pamuk is a great visionary of a possible future in the region for me. And he sees the failures of modernization in Turkey as based on the Kemalist project of radically dissevering Turkey's Islamic and Arab heritage from the modern nation state it wanted to be in the wake of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So his question is, to put it crudely, is how do we reintegrate these aspects of Turkey's cultural past, its cultural history, into a modern nation state that is a member of the family of nations in the international system that many of us are interested in creating and establishing. The same questions might be applied to Palestine, to Iran, and to other countries around the region. When it comes to Hamas in Palestine, I mean, they emerged after 40 years of deep Palestinian suffering and the failure of anything like a political process whereby their rights were recognized. So in response to Ambassador Grappo's critique of my observation, I would say that Hamas originally emerged out of the failure of something like global recognition of Palestinian humanity as manifest in national rights. And thus I come back to this idea of an emotional response to the conditions of deep and abiding human devastation and catastrophe.
Okay, thank you, Karim.
Micheline, I want to make
No,
one point further to
So 30 seconds behind
to
the clock.
Ahmed's, and it is true, of course, in 2017, Hamas issued this revised charter, which was watered down, not apparently violent as its initial one, but something else happened in 2017, which really ended up changing the character and the direction of Hamas. And that is the slow movement of the leadership from external officials who were resident outside of Gaza, whether it was in Damascus, Lebanon, Jordan, Doha, or Turkey, to the internal leadership, Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif, the head of their security branch. They took a very, very hard line, and they started calling the shots, irrespective of what they were hearing from their external leaders. It was a very harsh line. The external leaders probably were the ones who led the revision to the original 1988 charter, but I don't think it was acted on by the leadership within Hamas in Gaza. And today, pretty much all the decisions are made within Gaza by Sinwar and his fellow leaders within Hamas.
Okay, thank you so much, Gary. I'm going to now turn to Israel, the goal and the action since October 7. So let's start with you, Jonathan. Israel's war cabinet has said that their aims are to destroy Hamas and demilitarize the Gaza Strip. Let's say let's stay with that stated goal for just a moment. Do you think it's realistic, especially after these 100 first days?
I have a terrible record of political predictions. I'll put that out there. I have no idea. I guess I should say I don't think it's realistic, but I am not a policymaker. I'm not a futurist, and I'm not quite sure that I can answer that question in any way that will add value to the audience that's here today.
So I think that Ahmed is going to just weigh in.
Yeah, I remember the first event that we had here exactly 90 days ago. I was debating that with Ambassador Grabo, and my point was like, you can, of course, given the power, power is very asymmetric between Israel and Hamas. Of course, it was very expected that Israel would be able to destroy Hamas, much of Hamas military capabilities. But this idea of destroying Hamas and killing all political and military leaders and just start a new reality in Gaza without Hamas, finding non-Palestinian Authority loyals or non-Hamas loyals and a new authority in Palestine, in Gaza, to negotiate with, to me, is very unrealistic. And I guess, and I think, I deeply believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu knew from day one of the war that he wouldn't be able to destroy Hamas, the way at least he was portraying or explaining to the Israeli public on October 7th. Visiting the goals of Israel, October 7 to now, 100 days after, Israel didn't manage to, and that was the second declared official goal of the war that Israel launched on Gaza, was to bring all hostages alive back to Israel, which didn't happen so far. Of course, the good news is like we have more than 150 were brought back to Israel. Many of them, if not actually all of them, were civilians after the ceasefire or during the ceasefire. However, there are so many who are still in Gaza. We know for sure, even away from Hamas propaganda, but we know for sure, as admitted by Israel, that some hostages have been killed. Now, of course, we have to debate if they were killed by Hamas or by Israeli airstrikes. I myself think by Israeli airstrikes, but like I'm not there. I don't know much about the ground. And in my point of view, this war has no end because Prime Minister Netanyahu, for very selfish reasons, in my point of view, is trying to prolong this war as much as he can because he knows very well that the day the war is over is the day he will leave office for sure. And maybe tomorrow he will face some litigations. He will face some legal and political issues in his own cabinet and in his own country that can end up, in jail, or at least he will lose much of his political, significance and political career. And in my point of view, it became much more not of like achieving the goals of the war, but it became much more of a very selfish act by Netanyahu and his, at least the right-wing component of his government, to, just make this war endless or, take it as long as possible because of this desire to escape political accountability for the failure, political and security failure on October 7th.
Okay, thank you. As a follow-up, I just want to ask you these questions in light of the outcry against what is happening in Gaza. Ambassador Grapp, I will start with you, and it's a follow-up of the same question. But did Israel have a choice? Could they have done it differently?
Oh, in the grand scheme of things, yes. They could have done something else. The United States, after 9/11, could have done something else. But I think given the political realities, no. The Israeli government, the Israeli leadership was compelled to take the action that they took. You can certainly question the means, certainly by judging by the consequences that Israel has employed, but I don't think, practically speaking, the Israelis had a choice. They were going to have to respond in the very harsh way that they have, overly harsh way. In some ways, Americans have a little bit of insight into this. Those of us who are around after 9/11 understand how we all felt, how our American government felt. As Condi Rice acknowledged in her book, Americans felt a bloodlust. And we went after Afghanistan, and when that wasn't enough, we went after Iraq. And both ended up as disasters for the United States and have truly undermined the US's role in the world. So we're still paying for this. We're paying for it in terms of how unpersuasive we have been in organizing the rest of the world against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and similarly in this particular case of Hamas's attack on Israel. So we're paying a very, very heavy price. At that time, after 9/11, we saw the rhetorical excesses that we have heard from both Israelis and from Hamas. I won't repeat them. Sometimes they are for public consumption, that is their respective publics, but I don't think they reflect genuine policy. But nevertheless, this is what happens when you reach such a high emotional pitch, and there are political impulses that are impossible to circumvent. It takes extraordinary political discipline and wisdom, and we're not seeing a whole lot of that. I think to his credit, Joe Biden is able to see through it and is beginning to focus on what the day after looks like. We're probably one of the few countries that's proactively and publicly working toward that. But I don't want to be, and I don't think the administration is so naive to believe that this is going to be anything close to easy or quick. We're talking about years, because we will probably have to start, they will probably have to start from the ground level. And whether he's reelected or not, that effort will have to continue through successive administrations, because so much needs to be done on both sides to, first of all, address the trauma that both feel in this conflict, but then to assemble the structural requirements necessary to address the core issues of the problem. They're simply not there today. There's no will on the part of the Israeli leadership, and there's no capability on the part of the Palestinian leadership.
Okay, thank you so much. Do you want to respond, or can I just ask you another question?
I'd like to comment briefly on
Okay,
this
go ahead.
particular question. On Tuesday, Prime Minister Netanyahu said in a meeting with the settlement and kibbutz leaders that the war will extend through 2025. To touch on Ahmed's point about the possible permanence of this particular war. The original question about Israel's stated objective of destroying Hamas, well, that might be critically questioned in light of other statements by Israeli political leaders. Netanyahu has called Palestinians the seed of Amalek, which gives biblical justification for the destruction of Palestinian people. In the wake of the atrocities of October the 7th, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant called Gazans human animals, a kind of colonial civilizational discourse that justifies wholesale destruction. Far-right leaders like Bezalel Smotrich, the Minister of Finance, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Minister of National Security, have called for the destruction of Palestinians, have called Palestinians in toto Nazis, and have called for the leveling of Gaza in its entirety. There's numerous members of the Knesset. So stated objectives and implicit objectives, that should be critically questioned. When it comes to the goal of destroying Hamas, the indiscriminate bombing by US President Joe Biden's description of Israel's bombing of Gaza might be critically questioned as a means to achieve this particular objective, especially when it's led to 24,000 deaths and 10,000 deaths of children. How does this advance the objective of demilitarizing Gaza and destroying Hamas? Finally, on this particular question, what is the underlying logic of destroying Hamas? It's Israel's security, of course. How is Israel's security best achieved? This is an important question that we have to ask and consider when considering Israel's actual policies in Gaza. It seems to me that the wholesale destruction that we have witnessed over the last 100 days, including 24,000 deaths, a vast majority of whom are civilians, women and children, again, 10,000 children or more have been killed in this period, is likely to me to produce another generation of those who have an existential hatred of the state of Israel, another generation of young people who are hell-bent on attacking and destroying the state of Israel. If Israel's security is the imperative behind the stated objective of destroying Hamas, then what Joe Biden calls the indiscriminate bombing of Gaza does not seem to me a very wise or sensible way to go about it. And I'm on time this time.
You have 1 second. Okay. So thank you. Going back to the Denver Gazette, I'm going to just sort of shift a little bit here in the interest of time as well. Our friends at the Denver Gazette ask, what does a path to peace then look like? If it's not military solution, what is the political solution? So just starting from this side of, you want to start?
Pragmatically speaking, in my point of view, as someone who believes in the two-state solution, which means that I believe in the legitimacy of Israel, and I also believe in the inevitable state for the Palestinians. And in my point of view, this is the only way we can solve this very long kind of bloodshed. Practically speaking and pragmatically speaking, the only political solution is to negotiate a two-state solution. However, of course, there are so many technical problems here. Number one, who's negotiating from each side? From Israel, I don't think this is possible under Prime Minister Netanyahu. Maybe it's not possible under the Likud, unless the Likud decides to, push someone new face with different maybe background. But also speaking of Palestine, it doesn't seem to be possible with Hamas. Hamas' position right now is we don't actually accept the legitimacy of Israel. And the Palestinian Authority is very weak right now, and we know that for sure. And there are so many divisions inside. They have a very old leader who seems to be very, incapable of taking any real initiative to negotiate. So in my point of view, the answer is clear, but the technicality of how can that be, done is not clear. But I see no other reason or no other possible way to solve this issue but to negotiate a two-state solution like what happened in Oslo, 1990s. But again, the question will remain always like, who's going to negotiate this time? Back in the 1990s, we had Shimon Peres, we had Isaac Rabin, we had Yasser Arafat, so we had some leaders who, if you like them or not, but still they were charismatic and capable of taking decisions from both sides. Unfortunately, this time doesn't seem to be so.
Okay, thank you very much. I will just take 15
Sure.
seconds. Yeah, perhaps you want to also focus a little bit on the internal dynamic of the Israeli governments currently, the war cabinet, etc. No, Jonathan.
Okay. I don't know if I can do that, but I actually was going to say I'm actually only going to talk about Israel here. I won't even talk about the Palestinians, just to share my level of pessimism. Which and I believe that there should be a two-state solution, and I hope for it. But if we're going to talk about this in reality, we have to recognize some major barriers. And again, I'm not even going to talk about the Palestinian side where there are significant barriers. If we're looking at the Israeli side, even if we're going to talk about Oslo, which I think is romanticized, and my historical analysis of this is not my political analysis. This is just looking at it historically. Yitzhak Rabin, who was put in charge of trying to crush the first Intifada, even during peaceful protests, only met people with violence in many instances. And what Rabin, in my reading of this, came to realize was that the Israelis were actually dealing with the nationalist movement. This goes back to Gary's point from earlier on, and you could not crush this nationalist movement. And Israel really shouldn't be risking its own soldiers to do so. And so in my reading of Oslo, and you could argue that Rabin changed, we'll never know because he was assassinated in 1995. The Rabin government was willing to negotiate with the Palestinians for something pretty short of a two-state solution. I don't think that it was a true two-state solution the way that many people would consider it being. And a lot of things have changed since then, and I'll just list a couple of them. I'm always the person who's like a downer at parties when people look to me and say, like, solve the two-state solution. Or I've been looking at this for 22 years. Believe me, I would if I could. I live in Denver and I'm not a god. So I don't have the ability to do this. We really have to look at internal Israeli dynamics, political dynamics. The Israeli political system is a fused parliamentary executive unicameral legislature where with 120 seats, where you have to get 61 seats to be able to form a coalition, but the threshold for representation is 3.25%, which makes smaller parties the kingmakers, and they can refuse to join coalitions. I don't see how Israel could ever maintain a stable coalition in the short term, at least, to form a government. And when you look at the way that Israeli demographics are moving, they're trending far more conservative than in the past. This does not even take into account that 1 out of every 10 Jews in Israel lives outside the internationally recognized borders of the state. And so if you're effectively asking 10% of the population, who could theoretically represent anywhere between 10 and 15 members in the Knesset, to vote for a two-state solution that might lead to their physical uprooting. We saw what happened when settlements, a very small amount, 8,000 were, I think it's 8,000, please correct me if I'm wrong, were uprooted in 2004, 2005, and that led to major problems. I think the Israeli government fears that if they try to push through something, they would have to dismantle significant West Bank settlements, which might lead to a civil war within the state. That is just the Israeli side. I am at 0. I wish that I had more positive things to say.
Okay, so that's the reason why we're going to move to the direction of diplomacy here, because you are such a pessimist and we cannot afford that. So first, Karim, and then hopefully you're going to just carry the torch of optimism, whether you wish or not. Go ahead, Karim.
Well, of course, what Jonathan is saying is right, and there's been an implicit, a cold civil war brewing in Israel throughout the last year until October the 7th between secular Democrats and more extremist, settler-oriented, annexation-oriented coalition government members. Like Micheline mentioned in the opening remarks, there have been ongoing protests for, I think, 36 weeks up until October the 7th in Israel, protesting against the Likud coalition government's proposed judicial reforms, which would effectively abrogate Israeli democracy. Regarding a two-state solution, it is not just Netanyahu who's been bragging for the last several years about forestalling the creation or the possibility or the conception of a Palestinian state. I think it's the Likud administration itself, the Likud political party since the late 1970s under Menachem Begin, who have been actively working, one of whose primary objectives have been to forestall the creation of a Palestinian state. So these are very deep-rooted problems in the Israeli political system and in Israeli civil society as well. You asked me to be optimistic or positive. I am going to be positive because I do believe peace is possible. Whether any of us see it in our lifetimes is another question. But for me, it is premised on It's a sad thought, perhaps
May
undermining the
you leave
positivity.
a short life? No, I didn't mean to say that. Okay.
Yeah, okay. So
In
look,
jest,
it's
in
a
jest.
kind of visionary, deeply unpragmatic idea that's I, of course, understand the severe limitations and the pragmatic difficulties of even conceptualizing something like the restoration of ethical, cultural, historical, linguistic, and religious bonds between the Jewish and the Arab people today in the wake of October the 7th and the continuing disastrous bombardment of Gaza. But that is what I hope to articulate this evening and in my work moving forwards. Jews and Arabs, Jews, Muslims, and Christians throughout the dominions of Islam lived a peaceful coexistence, a life of peaceful coexistence for 1400 years up until 1948, just to use that as a crude historical marker. Anti-Semitism had no role within these societies up until that moment in the disastrous aftermath of 1948. Jews and Arabs, Jews, Christians, and Muslims within the Arab Islamic world considered themselves brothers and sisters, children of the book, descendants of Abraham, descendants of the Abrahamic religions. And for me, the cultural and ethical process of restoring the bonds against 75 years of hatred takes precedence over discussions of unpragmatic and frankly impossible at this current moment political solutions. Two-state, one-state, it's pie in the sky. When you have leaders on both sides who are interested in nothing but inciting the hatred of their people against the other, and frankly, a complete and utter lack of political will among the Americans who have the the power to solve this issue overnight if they wanted to. In doing so, what I want to do is encourage our intellectual institutions, academic institutions, and our brothers and sisters in Israel and Palestine to work via whatever means, whatever civil society organizations, whatever journalistic sources, whatever other kinds of cultural activities to restore their bonds with one another beyond the hatred, beyond the lies, beyond the terrorism, beyond the violence. That's a long-term solution.
Thank you so much, Karim. I'm going to leave with you, Gary, but I would like you to focus just briefly on not only a potential new regional architecture, but also how is Biden doing in this respect? Is he doing a good job? Should he do better? What are your thoughts about this?
First of all, Jonathan, if you think you're a downer at the party, tell people you were an American diplomat in the Middle East. Everybody starts looking at their drink glass and makes a bead for where all the bourbon is. Being a diplomat means being almost eternally optimistic. If you are not optimistic as a diplomat, you are useless. In a similar vein, if you don't have courage as a soldier, you are useless. And so, by definition, every diplomat I've ever worked with, certainly in my career, whether it's an American, Israeli, Arab, you name it, tend to be optimistic, some more pragmatic than others. With respect to the question of Joe Biden, I had a former colleague and very good friend who recently returned from Israel. He's doing great in Israel. Israelis love him for what he has done for the state of Israel. And for those of you who were present at the session in October, I had commented that Joe Biden is a very savvy operator when it comes to this issue. He truly knows it better than anyone else in the government. And he knows that if you want to move the Israelis, and he's going to have to move them, particularly someone as irresistible as, or as immovable as Bibi Netanyahu, you have to show the love first, which he has done. But he has been delivering a very, very harsh message to the Israelis, to Ahmed's point earlier about the concern for perhaps Bibi prolonging this conflict in the interests of maintaining his position as prime minister, one point that was delivered by Secretary Blinken last week in his visit to Israel, not widely publicized, is he warned the Israeli leadership to not escalate the conflict in northern Israel against Hezbollah. The United States does not want to see an escalation there. This conflict has already escalated throughout the region. And if you have any doubt about it, just read the news take in the media, what's happening in Syria, in Iraq, in southern Lebanon and northern Israel, in the West Bank, and of course, in the Red Sea, and in Iran. Israel is fighting a seven-front war. And one of the overriding desires of this administration is to contain the escalation. They're not doing a particularly great job in that respect. It's extremely hard, particularly when we have someone like the Iranians who have very little to lose. They are not being threatened. And as the grand puppet maker, or a puppet master with all of these various groups, are managing to create havoc, first and foremost with the Israelis, but also for the Americans and others who are concerned, who are interested in trying to resolve this conflict. I believe that this administration, however, does see a vague path ahead. And it's what this administration, it's why Blinken has made 4 trips to the region, Bibi 2, or I think Biden 2, and that is to begin moving the Israeli leadership to ratcheting down in the tempo of operations in Gaza and to begin to think seriously of a 2-state solution. Now, some Israelis are willing to acknowledge that in the current environment. Very few are, and this is where the administration is finding the most resistance. In other areas, and that is, for example, getting the Israelis to consider some of the humanitarian aspects, making some progress to lower the tempo of operations, doing that as well. But it's going to be a very, very heavy lift in the current political climate in Israel because the Israeli leadership is divided too. If you look in the war cabinet today, it's divided between Bibi and Gallant, the defense minister, who want to pursue the war to its objective, to their objective. And then you have Gantz and Eisenkot, both of whom were former generals, commanders of the IDF, who want to cut a deal in terms of the release of the hostages. The two sides cannot agree. And Mr. Netanyahu is pinned between the American administration, his war cabinet, and his right wing, who will not accept any compromise, any morsel, any crumb that's thrown toward the Palestinians. In fact, they're the ones who would like to see the Palestinians expelled from Gaza and maybe even from the West Bank. And without that right wing, of course, he is no longer prime minister. So we have a very, very complex and conflicted situation on both sides, which infinitely complexes the job of this administration.
Mhm.
And I'll repeat, the Americans right now are the only ones taking the initiative in searching for a solution to this, understanding that there must be at the end state 2 states.
Thank you so much, Gary. I'm going to first thanks for this part of the panel and move to the Q&A with the audience. So if there are, no. God, I feel good. I have some power today. I will give you at the end, but I just want to make sure that, first of all, before I pick up the question that is coming through the teleprompter, anyone who wants to stand up, and I see Reza on this side. Okay, I'm just going to pick a few of you and then just read from the teleprompter. Do not be offended. Impossible to cover all the grounds in this session. But the good news is that we're going to have so many other events, and it will come. I mean, all my questions is worth one full panel. We cannot do justice to any of it. So Reza, you want to stand up? I just saw your name, and Nathan. Hey, Nathan, is that you?
Yeah, greetings everyone. My name is Reza. I'm a second-year PhD student in international studies here at Corbell. And prior to coming to the US, I was also a political activist and a student activist in Iran. And today I would have really liked to hear more about Iran and the role of the Islamic Republic regime in creating all of these conflicts in the region, or at least being a motivator for many of the conflicts that we see in the region today. Because I think it's established fact that the Islamic Republic regime is funding many of these groups in the region, say Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and at least 17 others. And here's my question: how can we deal with the Islamic Republic regime? And because let's consider a possibility. If Israel manages to deal with Hamas, as they've mentioned this to be their goal, how long do we think it will take until the next radical group rises up to the occasion and starts to compete for the funding, which is the wealth of the people of Iran, donated to them by the Islamic Republic regime? So how do you think we can deal with the Islamic Republic regime at this point?
Okay, thank you so much, Reza. I will ask for other questions to be very short because we're running out of time. So you want to start answering this, or this side? Whoever want to chime in is welcome
sure.
to do it.
So yeah, I never believe an authoritarian regime. However, I only believed Iran this time when they said that they are not behind October 7 attack. And why I believe that, not because I think they are, telling the truth, but because I think this time, especially this time, Hamas looked like they were acting in their own. It was part of their strategy to defeat the Israeli intelligence, Mossad, and else, some other security establishments in Israel. But I agree with you that not just the Islamic regime of Iran is a problem. I guess it's not very accurate to come into this generalization. But as someone who studies authoritarianism in the Middle East, as long as we have authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, in what we call the Middle East, North Africa and the Middle East, we will always have problems. If not with Israel, it will be, civil wars in, our, Middle Eastern countries. And that's why I always refer to the very important fact, which I guess I'm not downplaying the importance of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but I also usually refer to how many hypocritic Arab and non-Arab, Middle Eastern, Islamic and secular authoritarian regimes in the Middle East are using the Arab-Israeli conflict in order to consolidate their own power within their own regimes. It's, perfectly done, subtly done. And I guess maybe some people are not aware of how many authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, Islamic or not, Islamic and secular equal, can really play always this card of Israel to justify and to consolidate their power inside, inside their own countries.
So one person here can chime in, and then I would move to the next question.
With respect to your question on Iran, which is a very good one, there are many reasons motivating the Islamic Republic of Iran's actions and activities in this conflict. But two to consider that I think are the most galvanizing in terms of the Islamic Republic's ability to connect with all these groups and organizations they sponsor throughout the region. Number one, it addresses their primary concern, and that is to get the United States out of the Middle East. And they all identify with that, whether it's the Houthis, whether it's the branch of Hezbollah that operates in Iraq, the militias in Syria, certainly Hezbollah, and so forth. The second issue, as Ahmed pointed out, is the Palestinian issue. You're never going to lose in the Middle East, siding with the Palestinians. Today, if you listen to the pronouncements coming from every single Middle Eastern government, it's just statement after statement supporting the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people. What you will not hear is any kind of statement endorsing Hamas, because after the Israelis there are about 6 Arab countries at least who want to see Hamas destroyed, starting with Saudi Arabia and Egypt. You can move along to Jordan, UAE, Bahrain, and a number of others. But this is these two are galvanizing issues, and it makes it kind of an easy sell, like trying to pitch ice cream to a child. They are embraced and endorsed. So removing this issue, that is the Palestinian issue, would certainly relieve all the pressures that not only the Israelis but the Americans face with respect to the Islamic Republic. But how we address the problem of Iran itself and its activities, its destructive activities in the Middle East, is probably a question for another session.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman in front of me, if you don't mind just standing up,
Yes.
identify yourself.
Thanks. My name is Jeff. I'm out of Windsor and work with a Christian organization out of Palestine. Citing seemingly intractable conflicts in the past and how they were resolved or not resolved, Peter Hain, the former Secretary of State in Ireland, said that the problem's only going to be solved politically. And he went on and made the point that instead of presidents and prime ministers in Washington, D.C., London, and Europe colluding in terrible failure, they should support a regional summit involving Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Jordan, Qatar, even the UAE. He said there'll be no stability in the region unless all parties are included. And I just wonder about your thoughts on that broad response.
I've never been a fan of grand conferences because you gather everybody together, for example, as George H.W. Bush did in 1988 in Madrid, with the support, by the way, of the Soviet Union. It made some progress, but it soon fizzled. The work of diplomacy, particularly in trying to address the underlying causes of a conflict, is long and it's iterative. It takes action after action after action before you possibly get to a solution. When I worked with Tony Blair, he used to love to sit on the top of the American Colony Hotel on a beautiful day and drink multiple espressos. And I asked him about his work in Northern Ireland and the years that he and others before him worked to resolve that issue. And it did take years. And he said, you know, rough count, we met in negotiations 800 times and we failed before the last one. And it succeeded. Now, Israelis and Palestinians, they haven't recently met multiple times before. I've been at a number of those sessions. Sometimes it was progress. Sometimes we would backslide. We need to start that process again. I mean, I'd love to see a grand conference, but there's too much work that goes in to resolving a conflict that is as deep and complex as this one, where the narratives are so strongly held by both sides. And it's going to take a lot of enlightened leadership and wisdom and sacrifice. And the only way you sort of get to the point is repeated diplomacy, acts of diplomacy. Sometimes maybe in a large setting, as you suggested, but more often it's sitting across the table, pounding the table, yelling at one another, screaming, stepping out, and coming back in and starting again. And that happens most of the time, actually.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. You want to add?
Yes, I have a one-sentence response to each of the questions. The kind of grand conference I would like to see is between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim organizations, possibly such as KUSA, who are outraged, ethically, morally, religiously outraged by the violence they're witnessing on all sides and want to work together to find an ethical basis for a political solution. And regarding Iran, I think the ambassador was sort of gesturing towards this: fix Palestine, and you remove one of the major ideological planks of the Ayatollah's reign in Iran itself, as well as its support of Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and others.
Wonderful. So can I take another question? Well, if my team is not coming fast, okay. Comment on the ICJ court case South. Are you really going for this? Okay, comment on the ICJ court case South Africa versus Israel. I'm reading it for the teleprompter. Will the Global South lead the initiative to end the war? That's a big word, the Global South. Okay, anyone want to answer that? I would have tweaked it over there, but okay.
If I may.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. First of all, I'm very suspicious of this term Global South, academically speaking, and I have doubts about, what do we really mean by the Global South? Because my claim is always we can find Global South even in Europe and even in here. So, but anyways, this is a different debate. First of all, let me say that South Africa has a very right to claim that Israel has committed genocides against the Palestinians in Gaza. Technically, if that is true or not, now this is left to the ICJ. My position is always, let's stick to international law. And sticking to international law, in my point of view, there have been, for sure, war crimes committed against the civilians. I'm not speaking about fighters or militants, but against civilians in Gaza. If we consider international humanitarian law, we can see for sure collective punishment. We can see for sure indiscriminate targeting of many civilians and military targets in Gaza. And to me, whether this is technically is considered by the ICJ, and who knows when they will make their final decision, maybe it takes years or months or nobody knows. But for me, whether this is decided by the ICJ or not, for me, there are so many crimes, war crimes committed against the civilians in Gaza.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I just take more questions just to roll the ball? Over there, gentlemen, what's your name? And you, okay, you're providing, okay. All right, we'll get to that, yes.
All right, thank you so much. My name is Prosper. I'm an international student here. I'm a first year. I'm studying towards international development master's program. My question is actually directed to Africa itself, and I like the point which was recently made that there is little presentation of the Global South. Recently, I can just refer to the new peace process of this conflict. Actually, the Israel government has actually announced that they are sending refugees to African countries, including Chad, Congo, and Rwanda, with some payouts. So I would like to understand, I'm not coming from a point where I'm deconstructing or interrogating. I want to just understand through a constructive view, is this particularly a good initiative for Africa itself as part of the new peace process of this conflict, considering that these countries are already impoverished, they're actually also having some humanitarian crisis, and they're very unstable, to send the Palestinians who have been displaced in Gaza to Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this is a
very, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I'm happy to address this. These are plans at the moment. They haven't started doing so since the beginning of the conflict. In the first week, Netanyahu was touring European countries, trying to garner support for the idea of sending Gazan so-called refugees, permanent exiles, most of them are refugees from 1948 in the first place, to European countries as part of a resettlement process. In the 2 weeks after the war, an Israeli think tank called Meskev developed a comprehensive plan for the resettlement of Gaza's civilian population in Egypt, down to the cost of buying apartments in the suburbs surrounding Cairo, the suburbs of Cairo. I think they calculated that it will cost the state of Israel about $5 to $8 billion to resettle a vast majority of Gaza's civilian population. And of course, the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence produced a similar plan for the resettlement of Gaza's civilian population in Egypt shortly afterwards. These have all failed thus far. The European countries have rejected these propositions. Egypt, of course, under the leadership, if that's the right word, of President el-Sisi, has outright rejected the resettlement of Gaza's civilians in Egypt. And this is why the Israeli government is trying to petition African countries to take in Gazan refugees at the moment. I think the US administration, Blinken and Biden, have been very, very vocal in the rejection of any such resettlement solution for Gaza.
Yes, I would like to remind those of you who want to keep discussing with the panelists, we're going to have a few more questions. They can do so at the end of this conversation. So do not feel overly frustrated if you couldn't get to you. We try our best within the time that we have. There is here a question I see on my teleprompter. The US provides $3 billion in annual unconditional aid to Israel. How does this affect its role as a mediator? Jonathan, why don't you start with this?
Sure, I'll start with some, as I keep doing, I don't know if you want it or not, but some context here. Israel has been the largest recipient of budgeted aid in most years since 1976 from the United States. There are a couple of years where I believe Afghanistan and Iraq had more during the global war on terrorism, the U.S. activity, the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But in general, this has been the case. I think that there's this sense that the U.S. has always been a significant supporter of Israel, and I think in the political arena and with economic aid, that has been the case. But if we look at between 1948 and 1970, the United States averaged less than, even in today's dollars, $1 billion a year in aid to Israel. It's really, in my reading, only after the Nixon doctrine that the United States and the French embargo during the '67 war that Israel becomes the chief aid supplier to, or the United States becomes the chief aid supplier to Israel. Keep in mind, as a result of the Camp David peace accords of 78, 79, Egypt also receives a significant amount of aid, roughly, I believe, 40% of what Israel
1.3.
Yeah. And I think so. My point here is I don't think that it's aid that is holding things up. I do have a theory that I will share with everyone about sort of what impacts the US's role as a mediator, even when it has been a mediator. I don't think it's always been maybe the I don't know, most honest or best mediator. And my historical reading of this, I think, again, going back, so you often hear arguments that the U.S. has always been Israel's best friend since 1948, or sometimes people will say it's only because of lobbying in the United States. I actually reject that analysis. I think that if you look at the United States in the 1950s, the House of Representatives and the Senate became extremely supportive of Israel prior to the executive becoming extremely supportive. And we see massive US public support of Israel in the 1950s and early 1960s prior to the executive becoming as supportive as it did, which in my reading is after 1967. But in this reading, once the executive did take the position that it would be extremely supportive of Israel, it was effectively impossible to backtrack because Congress would not allow it. And the US public was extremely pro-Israel. And that's where I think, in my view, if we're going to talk about lobbying, and I know I'm the one who brought it up here, no one else, I think that their role is helping maintain the status quo in that sense, as opposed to galvanizing the support. So I guess my answer to this was it would be it's not the money that is impacting the US's role as a mediator. It has historically been strong bipartisan support in the House and the Senate and among the US general population, which has prevented the executive from maybe taking a more forceful stand. Others up here might disagree, but that's been my reading of the history.
Just one point. First of all, it's not $3 billion a year; it's 3.8 under the agreement that was a 10-year agreement that was negotiated during the Obama administration. The question, are we the appropriate mediator? The real question is, if not the United States, then who? Tell me who it would be. The EU? Are you kidding? They're not interested. They'll be happy to work with the parties in the United States. They're not interested. So who else would there be? The Chinese are not trusted, maybe perhaps by some Palestinians and other Arabs, but given what's happened after October 7th, certainly not by the Israelis. The only country that has the power and the influence and the capability to do anything, whether you agree with it or not, is the United States. And of course, up to this point, we haven't done a very good job. But you can't beat something with nothing. Someone has to step up and take the lead, and we have been that. And we will continue to be that until there is another option, which I don't think there will be. You can argue whether we're fair, we're unbiased. No, we're not. There's no question the United States is pro-Israeli, but we're not anti-Palestinian. In fact, Mr. Biden has made it very clear, as we've all said before, this administration is a strong supporter of two states. And the only country that can play this role is the United States. And Arab countries acknowledge that too. Perhaps not publicly, but in all the rounds that Mr. Blinken made last week throughout the Middle East, nobody slammed the door in his face, not even the Turks, because they recognize that we're the only one who can play that role.
Okay, as Winston Churchill say, we should never let a crisis go to waste, and may that be the case, that the United States rates to the task of moving the peace process forward. There is just one last question. You want to take it?
Can I, one sentence on the previous comments, given the overwhelming amount of diplomatic and military as well as financial support to Israel that the United States provides, then surely if it was serious about a Palestinian state, a peace process, or whatever that means, it would use that as leverage for implementing its will. Why does it not do so?
Thank you very much. Actually, we did reach our 7:30 time, so we won't take a last question, but do not be disappointed. You can come here and just talk with the panelists. They're here to provide their answers for the questions that were not sufficiently well developed. Please remember, this is just one of many, many other events that we will have. I'm so pleased by this panel, and I think they really are worth, I mean, this is worth a really great applause for a wonderful conversation. I thank you so much for your courage and civil discourse and great engagements. May there be many more events like that. Thank you to the Denver Gazette and the Channel 9 News for partnering with us. I hope you keep doing that in the future.